Hey, herd watchers. All right, so obviously you're catching me in the car, but I wanted to talk about the culture war. We've been talking about this for a while, and what was sort of, you would think of as a very diplomatic sort of war, a Cold War, has obviously heated up. We're not in full-scale civil war, but we're getting there. The left's natural drive and their decades-long march towards institutionalized political violence has erupted, and you now have left-wing supporters, as opposed to simply rioting when something specific happens that they don't like. They've been doing that for a long time. Rioting when court cases don't go their way, rioting when a law is passed that they don't get their way. That sort of normal anti-democratic process where you threaten an electorate with violence if they don't go your way has now been brought down even before that. And the violent attack on the democratic process now is aimed at shutting down speech they don't like. And this is the end result of that tendency, that thing they've been doing for a couple of decades now, where speech they disagree with is become synonymous with abuse and thus assault. And that allows them to respond to speech with physical violence, because they've laid the groundwork for this sort of moral equivalence that if I say the wrong thing to the wrong person and that they are then walking around with PTSD feeling like they were abused, well, then clearly I was abusing them and they could act in self-defense and hit me. So now, whenever you have political speech that the left doesn't like, you are now getting, these masked, armed people getting together in groups, throwing explosives in some cases, assaulting people with objects, bike locks, and chains. And they're doing this, as they did during the Trump campaign, in an attempt to physically intimidate their political opponents into being quiet and shutting down. And it's not working for them. And as a result of that, they've sort of become maddened by this. It's driving them into larger and larger acts of violence. All the while, a masked dude is using a bike lock to beat the crap out of someone who wasn't even looking at him. He's screaming about how he's defending us against fascism. And that's the thing. They're defending us against fascist speech by employing physically violent tactics. And if that's not the height of dissonance idiocy, why can't I speak? Whatever. Cognitive dissonance. It's just idiocy, and you have to see it for what it is. Just a sad sophistry that's attempting to let the institutional left go ahead and use violence to get its ends, all while pretending that they're not being violent or that they're defending against violence. We see this in Europe. This is the way the European left has been for a while, and obviously the American left is constantly trying to drive us to that European model for this reason. As Europe moves towards totalitarian, authoritative government and then uses the citizenry to take violent action to oppose political speech that they don't like in political opposition, this is what we're going to get in the U.S. This is what the left has been driving us towards. But what's interesting is that the right is no longer sitting back and simply taking it. We are using the power of the internet, which is changing things. We're using the power of ubiquitous cameras, which is changing things. These are the tools the left thought was on their side, that they were going to be filming every police officer in America and sort of hounding them off the streets that way. But now those cameras are being turned on the left. And the normal tactic of just throwing a bandana over your face is not effective when you live in a social media world where before and after that you were shown without your mask on. So while it is possible to evade recognition, the operational security, the self-discipline that you would need to do that, to keep a zero social media profile, to not appear at any of these rallies and in any of these political environments uncovered, and then so that you could later appear covered, very few people have that sort of discipline, and certainly very few people on the left have so far shown it. So in this, our first, what's probably going to be a couple videos on this culture war thing, we have to talk about the political assassination of political figures and the media assassination of media figures. The left just managed to take down Bill O'Reilly. The left has managed to take some members out of the Trump campaign. They've so far failed to take down Bannon. They've failed to take down Sean Hannity, but they're trying, and they're experimenting with their tactics. And if we don't see it for what it is, them A/B testing their tactics and working on figuring out what in the new media environment they can do to shut down with sort of that harassment of media figures that they disagree with, then we're missing a bet. We have to pay attention to what they're doing. They're evolving their tactics and they're testing them. And if the mainstream Republican right is still playing the old game where an accusation of abuse and an accusation of sexual misconduct sends them scattering to the hills, they have not yet figured out that they will be rewarded for standing up and fighting back and saying, screw that noise. I didn't do that thing, and I'm not going to run away just because you're accusing me of it. Those accusations are losing power. But for right now, the left is still able to collect some scalps with it because they're using these new thuggery tactics against institutions that are simply incapable of dealing with it. In any case, so this is, we focused in this little video about sort of why there's been an increase in political violence, and you need to keep looking at who it comes from. All through the Trump campaigns, you had violent leftist protesters beating the crap out of people, destroying property, destroying cars, setting fires, all the while claiming that Trump supporters were being violent. You have college students occupying buildings, setting fires on college campuses, assaulting people, faking hate crimes, doing all this to create a atmosphere of physical fear, all the while screaming to anyone who listen about how that actually they're fighting back against fear. But they're using physical violence to fight against words they find distressing. And we're seeing this more and more and more. France has a huge problem with this with immigrants. Their immigrant population is coming in specifically because they can use violence freely. England has a large problem with violence on this fashion. Most of Europe is seeing more trouble this way. And obviously, there's a connection to the tactics of terrorism as well. It's going to get worse, and I think it's probably here to stay. I think we're looking now at a permanent situation where if you go to a political rally that the left disagrees with, you have to be worried that they're going to show up in force with their faces covered and attempt to beat the hell out of you. But I think we can get through that. I think we can simply evolve our tactics and fight back. And in the end, we're capable of putting out more violence than they are. We're more disciplined. We're less tied to our own weakness and victimization. There's only so much violence and discipline that someone who believes that they need 5 Xanax a day to function and that if they're going to die, they're capable of. They're weak people by nature. If they were capable of the sort of mental and intellectual and emotional rigor that would be required to really be super successful in a full-on altercation, they wouldn't be, tofu-eating people to start with. It just wouldn't be the kind of person we're dealing with. Obviously, I'm exaggerating. Some of my best friends are vegetarians. I can't wait for them to, figure out they're wrong, but I love them anyway. In any case, we will win, they will lose. We own all the guns. We have most of the veterans. We are the people with emotional independence. We are the people who are self-reliant and self-disciplined. We are the people who wake up in the morning and attempt to get through the day without needing 5 therapy appointments, 4 pills, and to make sure that we don't see anything that's not made of soy in our lives without breaking down into a nightmare. How can you seriously expect a movement who feels that they are driven to the point of PTSD if they hear a word they disagree with, or that revels in the fact that when they heard they got catcalled, that they had to go huddle in a corner and sob for 5 or 6 hours. These people are not capable of really sustaining a long-term campaign of violence. There's always going to be a core violent undergroup, mostly the remnants of the movement that the Soviet Union fostered in the United States, that will use the sort of tofu-eating left as convenient resources, bases of operation, money, emotional support, and then use those to continue their campaign of violence in an attempt to bring down capitalism the way they have, like I said, since the Soviets embedded them in the nation in the 40s and 50s. But we'll prevail. We just gonna have to wake up and realize that we have to actually defend ourselves against people who are more than happy to use violence. And I'm a little worried about that, because the left has been openly using violence and calling what are riots and criminal sprees protests for a while now, and the right has sort of let it happen. Hopefully Donald Trump can show the way, because he certainly doesn't tolerate it, and he's seeing some success. Maybe the rest of the GOP will grow a backbone. Maybe the rest of the right will grow a backbone. And we'll say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be driven out of this. That if the left threatens violence, if we have a rally, that we're going to put a bunch of people on the border and let them come. And I know that sounds like I'm pushing for violence, and I'm not. I abhor the idea. But more than I dislike the idea of political violence, I absolutely do not believe that democracy can survive one party unilaterally feeling free to use violence to shut down the speech of the other. If I have to advocate that the GOP starts taking self-defense and security at these events seriously, then that's what we have to do. We have to be serious about being defensive. In any case, let me know your thoughts down below. Herd watching, HERDWATCHING.com. Herd watching on the web, herd watching on Facebook, herd watching on YouTube, and riding herd, RIDING, herd. And you can find that on Facebook. You can find that on Twitter. And check it out. See what you got going on. Talk to you guys later.